don't block the path of inquiry. Don't lay down rules that make it impossible for people to ask important questions.
Welcome to the Thought Stretchers podcast, where we hope to stretch your thinking about important issues in education through rich inquiry. My name is Drew Perkins, and I'm your host for these conversations for complexity and nuance. In this episode, I spoke with Robert Barnett, who is one of the co-founders of Modern Classrooms Project and the author of a new book titled Meet Every Learner's Needs, Redesigning Instruction so All Students Can Succeed. Fundamentally, the Modern Classrooms Project is one of differentiated instruction, although the way that they approach the instruction and when and where it is happening is a bit different from much more traditional classrooms. So I asked Robert to explain the genesis and journey of the Modern Classrooms Project and how they came up with this idea, and asked him about some of the ways in which it may go wrong or some of the things that they do to keep it from going wrong, as well as some of the things that they would consider as evidence of things going right. One thing that I definitely appreciate is that they are embarking on collecting evidence through a randomly controlled trial study to see if their approach actually does yield positive results. Time will tell about that, but it certainly is an interesting way to think about structuring a classroom, and probably not for everyone, as he notes, but something that might be worth looking into. If you are interested in differentiated instruction or other professional learning like our project-based learning or knowledge-rich inquiry-based learning, I invite you to go to our website, which is at wegrowteachers.com. There you'll find this podcast, all of our blog content, and our professional development offerings. I'll also mention that we are in the final weeks of early bird registration for our PBL Grow 25 Summer Conference. Also on the topic of project-based learning, I'll remind folks that we recently released our Thought Stretcher's Guide to Project-Based Learning. It's a free PDF download, and you can find that by going to any of our blogs, and you'll see a link on the right side, or just search for Thought Stretcher's Guide to Project-Based Learning. As always, please feel free to reach out to me with any comments, questions, concerns, or ideas at drew@thoughtstretchers.org. And now here's my conversation with Robert. I am with Robert Barnett. We're going to talk about his new book, Meet Every Learner's Needs, and the Modern Classrooms Project, which is the heart of the work that he's doing. But as I usually like to do, I want to welcome you to the podcast, give you an opportunity to say hello and introduce yourself and all those good things.
Well, thank you. I'm glad to be here. I'm Robert Barnett. About 10 years ago, I was a teacher, public school teacher, and I was really struggling. I would walk into school every day. I'd look at my students. I realized in any one class, there were students who were all over the place in terms of their skills, their interests, their background. And when I tried to teach the day's lesson, some of them were advanced. They already knew the content. They were bored. Some of them were behind. They weren't prepared to understand. They felt lost. Some students weren't there at all. And it was really tough. So I had to try to figure out, okay, how do I actually teach a lesson that engages all these diverse learners, all at once and is accessible to students who miss class? And so I spent several years figuring that out for myself. Once I had a method, which I'm sure we'll talk about, I shared that with colleagues. A few of us decided to start a nonprofit together to help share this even farther. Today, we've empowered about 80,000 teachers all over the world, help them respond to this challenge of teaching, which is how do you meet diverse learner needs all at once in the same room, and have just written a book about it in hopes that will, share these techniques with even more teachers all over the world.
Okay, well, it's definitely a good start. I'd like to dig a little deeper on your background. I like to ask this question sometimes and lots of times because I think it kind of gives a little context on how you think about education. What was your, sort of K-12 education experience like? And then you said you were a teacher, so what was your teacher preparation like?
Yeah, I had a great education experience myself, and that's why I probably became a teacher, because I looked at school as an exciting place with learning. I always went to schools where there were small classes, and I felt like teachers could give me the individual attention that I needed, whether there were some subjects where I was excelling or other subjects where I was struggling. I really loved math, So I was a math teacher. I have that experience myself of being a math student in class that is, I get this, like, let's move on already. I want something challenging, but I knew that some of my friends didn't get it. And so even though it was a small class, that was a challenge for my teachers. There were other subjects, oftentimes English stands out to me as a subject where, sometimes I didn't always love like the books we were reading. Maybe I wasn't fully prepared for class. I hadn't done the reading. I felt sort of lost in class. And so I have that experience also of being in a class and thinking like, what's going on? I don't get it. I'm just going to tune out. So even though I had great experiences, I also can remember feeling sometimes bored and sometimes lost. And I think that everyone listening probably can relate to that. When you're in a class, sometimes when the teacher is trying to teach one lesson to the middle or the average student, it doesn't meet your needs. I went into teaching, because I liked my own experiences as a student. I liked working with young people, and what I really wanted to do was work with young people. I found that when I started teaching, and I was teaching, one lesson per day from the front of the room, I wasn't actually working with young people a lot. I was up at the board trying to hold their attention, control their behavior, get them to pay attention. But they weren't paying much attention when it was too easy or too hard, or they had missed class and they were lost. So part of what I tried to figure out is like, how can I actually work with the young people? How can I get to know them? How can I build relationships with them? How can I sit down with them and have the experience that I enjoyed as a student and that I wanted as a teacher, which is getting to know and support and encourage young people, even in classes of 25, 30 students.
And your teacher pre-service, what was that like in terms of getting you prepared, certification, that kind of thing?
Yeah, I did an alternative certification program called Teaching Fellows because I didn't study education in college. That was really focused on behavior management. And I think the theory was, if you can get your students to behave, you can engage them in the content. What I came to realize actually is that I think that's backwards. The best way to get students to behave is to engage them in content, right? If students want to learn, they want to be successful. If you can make sure that students are challenged and supported every day, you're not going to have behavior problems. So I spent, several months trying to get my students to sit down and be quiet. But when I had their attention, like, I wasn't doing anything with it because they knew the content or they were lost. So once I figured out a different way to teach where I was actually challenging and supporting students at different levels at the same time, my classroom management problems disappeared.
Well, maybe we'll get into some of the experiences that you have working with teachers and, thinking about preparing teachers and that kind of thing. I'm curious to the extent how you think about that and any work that you've done there. But let's talk about, Modern Classrooms Project. How'd you come up with the name? Is there any particular, there's got to be some particular reason for that name?
Yeah, I mean, I guess maybe I can explain briefly this model that I keep talking about, and that will lead into the name. What I ended up doing instead of being at the board teaching one lesson per day is I took my instruction, I put it on video. So I would sit down in front of my computer, I'd start a video call with myself, hit record, explain something, stop the recording, and then share that with my students to watch. They could watch that in school, they could watch it at home, they could pause, rewatch, rewind, watch with their families, etc. And if they had questions in school, they could just call me over during the video. This also meant that my students could now learn at their own paces. So my advanced learners could move very quickly. My learners who needed more time had more time. And if you missed class on Monday and Tuesday, the student didn't come in and start on Wednesday's lesson. They could come in on Wednesday, but start on Monday's lesson since the lesson was on video. So they were on video, they were moving at their own paces, and then I could make sure that students actually understood things before moving from lesson 1 to lesson 2. So I could say, Drew, show me that you understand, lesson 1. If you got it, great, you're ready for lesson 2. If not, go back, let's work on lesson 1, let's work together, let's make sure you get it before you advance. And I felt like that prevented my learners from developing gaps, and it built their confidence as well. So that was the method that I used. And I love teaching like this because I'm no longer at the board performing, policing behavior. I'm sitting with young people to help them learn. My students liked it too, because it's not like stressful, like the teacher's telling me to pay attention, but I don't get it. They were always feeling challenged. And so that was the approach. My co-founder Kareem and I were looking for a name, and I don't know exactly what it was, but we were thinking, what is it about this classroom? And I thought, this is a modern classroom because it wasn't a technology heavy classroom. My students watched my videos for 5 or 10 minutes, then they closed the computers so they could work with me and with each other. But what was making this approach possible was modern technology. It was videos. And so I said, okay, maybe we should call this modern classrooms. The classroom you picture in your head probably hasn't changed in 150 years. It's the teacher at the front of the room lecturing to a bunch of students sitting in desks. I think we need to replace that one-size-fits-all approach. We need something more modern. Technology makes that possible, and that was the name, Modern Classrooms.
Okay. So one of the things or ways that you describe it in the book is digitizing direct instruction. And I have lots of conversations with cognitive science of learning kinds of folks as I sort of advocate for inquiry and think about that sort of spectrum of pedagogy. I'm curious how you would define direct instruction, and how, is there consistency with sort of the science of learning, the ways that they use it? Of course, there's capital D, direct instruction, there's small d, direct instruction, there's explicit instruction, some differences in all three of those. When you're doing these videos, so you're creating videos that are essentially what you're saying is direct instruction, how does it look in comparison to what you might see sort of science of learning folks advocate for as direct instruction?
Yeah, when I say direct instruction, what I mean is explaining content directly to students. So anytime you're going to explain something to a student, you could stand at the board and explain that to all of your students at once, and you could do that, 4 times a day every year. Or you could make a video once that explains that content, and now your students can watch it anytime, anywhere, and you're free to support them. My class, actually, I did use a lot of inquiry. So I didn't do so much like the traditional I do, we do, you do. I would have students start with a math problem. They would work on that math problem. They would struggle on that math problem. We'd talk about the math problem. And then the video would be sort of my explanation or synthesis of the problem. I'd say, okay, now that you've struggled with it, like rather than bringing my whole class together to discuss it all at the same time, I'd say, okay, work on this problem, work on it with some classmates. Now go watch the video. I'm going to explain to you how I would solve the problem, and I'm going to introduce a new concept, and then you can go practice it. So when I thought about what's the video, I would think about what do I want to directly teach my students? What would I explain at the board in a lesson? And let me just do that on video instead. I think it is, I'm not saying that the right way to teach is I do, we do, you do. That's not actually what I believe. I believe students should struggle productively on problems, and then the explanation sort of helps after they've done the struggle. But the video replaces whatever the teacher would say at the board. And so there are teachers who use modern classrooms who use videos to introduce every concept. It's totally I do, we do, you do. There's also where the video just sort of replaces the I do. There are also teachers who are much more inquiry based, where the video comes after the problem or the productive struggle. It's really about freeing up teacher time, so you're not explaining things from the front of the room. You're sitting down with students while they watch the video, and it's about making that explanation accessible when students miss class or need to rewatch or want to watch at home with their families.
Okay. So not necessarily, but potentially things like interleaving and retrieval practice and things that the science of learning folks would talk about, especially I think with math, those things could be a part of it, but not necessarily. Is that how am I getting that right?
Yeah, I think, what I felt like is whenever I'm trying to explain something directly to my students, that's usually better done on video. Because if I do it once from the front of the room, some students will be bored, others will be lost, others will be absent. And I'll get frustrated because the students are disengaged and I'm trying to hold their attention. You know, so anytime I want them to, I want to explain something directly to them, let me do that through video. So it frees me up and it makes the learning accessible.
Okay. So then I'm thinking, trying to, sort of envision what this might look like just logistically. And you talk about it in the book, and obviously folks will get a better picture of it if they get the book. But, just to get a sense of, how do we get a sense of what students, their prior academic achievement, for example, like where are they, what do they know, what don't they know, how do we figure out what they are able to do and where they need to sort of, I guess, go as an entry point, which video, right, which piece of content that they would need to address or, I guess, view.
Yeah, so the way I thought about this is I would have students self-pace or learn at their own paces in what I called an interval. So I realized if I start students on the first day of school and say, move at your own pace for the whole school year, then students will get really far apart. That's probably too much autonomy for young people to have. They need some guidance. So I would say, like, for the next 2 weeks, we're all going to move at our own paces. Here's the content that I hope you'll get through by the end of the 2 weeks. And so everyone starts in the same place on the same lesson. The advanced students are probably going to start moving very quickly to, they might do the first 2-3 lessons in a day. The students who need more support may take more time at that first stage, and that's where I could try to figure out, because I have the time to sit with them, like, okay, what are they struggling with? What prerequisite skill are they missing? Maybe I have that information from a diagnostic test, but maybe I don't. I can sort of figure it out in real time and support them. And so I think everyone is starting in the same place at regular intervals and then moving through the content at their own pace. One thing you may think is, okay, well, if students are doing that, like, how do you ensure that every student gets through everything? And my answer is, it's inevitable that some students are going to get through more content than others. Like, some students are there more, some students come in with higher skills. And so what I try to do is prioritize my content. What are the things in this 2-week period that every student actually has to get? What are the things that are nice to have but not necessary? What are the sort of extensions that are really going to motivate the advanced learners? So, there's a trade-off, right, between the demands of the curriculum and the needs of students. It's a balancing act to figure out what every student actually has to do versus what you're going to make optional. But I think we have to make sure that every student actually can achieve understanding. And the best way to do that is to give students the time and support they need at each sequential lesson to reach that level.
And what do you recommend? Because I'm thinking of the tech limitations or problems and snafus, which I'm sure you've probably experienced and thought through, right? Like, where are these videos? How do they access them? And I would imagine it may be case specific. There might happen differently in some places, but when you talk about having those things available, obviously that is dependent on those things, any system, the things going well, and what happens when those things don't go well. I can't log in, I can't, the internet's not working, or it's not working quickly enough, or it's blocked, or some weird, there's almost always some weird little tech snafu. So kind of talk us through how you, I guess, stay ahead of those kinds of concerns.
Of course. I mean, one thing I would say is that this idea of self-paced and mastery-based learning, technology facilitates it. I think videos are quite good. It's not required. In some way, the original quote-unquote modern classroom is the one-room schoolhouse that we had 200 years ago. If you think about the one-room schoolhouse, you probably had students of different ages moving through different content at their own paces, supporting one another, learning from books instead of screens. And so you can use a lot of these practices, like letting students move at their own paces, requiring mastery, without technology. Of course, I think technology is really helpful. Videos are helpful. Those things do arise inevitably that you're saying. I mean, in terms of where you organize things, a lot of most teachers at this point have some kind of learning management system. Maybe they know how to use it really well, maybe they don't. I think there's some pretty simple things you can do in a learning management system just to make a clear and logical path for students, and that actually often helps the teacher plan, right? If I can make a clear path in my learning management system, that forces me to plan well for my students. When there's the Wi-Fi is out, certainly happened to me, or the computers aren't working, like, it's fine to do a whole class lesson from time to time. Maybe you do that at some points. You got to do the best you can every day, right? I often found that if the internet wasn't working and I did a whole class lesson, like, it was good to do that. At least it was productive. It was better than nothing. But students often felt like, man, I wish the internet were working, because I much prefer this style of learning from videos at my own paces. So, if you're a teacher and you're thinking, well, I have unreliable internet, I would encourage you to think about, can you get some of this self-paced, mastery-based pedagogy without technology? And also to have a little plan. If the internet's not working one day, we'll do a review activity that all students can access. We'll do more of a whole class discussion. We'll play a game, or I know where my students are at. I'm going to try to do 2 mini lessons, each with half the class, and make the best of it. This is certainly not a perfect solution by any means, but I found it to be, in general, more effective than the traditional instruction I had been giving.
Okay. So the videos are fairly short, I think you said. You want to do mastery checks to see, do they get it? Do they understand it? I assume those are sort of quick, multiple choice, or are they, show your work kinds of things? And how quickly? I mean, one of the things, and I appreciate the sort of systems thinking that you're trying to do here, essentially, right? How do we use a system to help enable and empower students and make things work smoothly? I did some of that in the project-based learning work. We don't have to get into that, but there are some things that you can put in place, but there are also some things that can go wrong, or some inefficiencies and things like that. So what do those mastery checks look like? And you say, well, it also gives an opportunity to sit with, one or a small group of students to help them on some of the things they might still be struggling with. What does that look like, especially if you've got, again, students that are in different places and, I need help with this, but you're helping that group with another thing. What do I do in that meantime? Those kinds of things.
Yeah, so I think those are 2 different questions. I'll address the second one first, which is sort of how the class works. Like, I think of a modern classroom, it's kind of like a college library, in my opinion. You walk into a college library, you'll probably see some students who are watching videos, working independently. You'll probably see some students sitting together in small groups, kind of working through things together. And then maybe not in the college library, but in the modern classroom, there's a teacher who's sort of monitoring it and helping facilitate. So, as a teacher, yes, that can be a challenge. You have 4 different students who all need your help. How do you help them all at once? I mean, I think part of it is encouraging a culture of collaboration and saying, look, if I'm busy working with one student, find someone else who can help you. And I think that collaboration is actually much easier in a modern classroom because the teacher's not up at the board, right? Like asking students to be quiet. Students are free to collaborate. So part of it is about having that collaboration. Part of it as a teacher is just being able to, get students back on track quickly. And part of it is knowing what other resources exist. So if a student's really struggling on one concept, I might say, let me point out your mistake. Let me give you one tip. Why don't you go back to this video and watch the second half of the video again or something, so I can try to triage those things quickly. Again, it's not perfect, but that's how I did it. That's how a lot of teachers do it. In terms of what mastery checks are, when I started teaching, I was given exit tickets Exit ticket was one problem you gave at the end of each lesson to see did students understand. My exit tickets were predictable. I would give it when the bell rang. Half the students would get it, who were there would get it. Half the students who were there wouldn't get it. Some students weren't there at all, so I didn't get their exit ticket. It wasn't very useful for me, right? Because I just knew, like, first of all, I could predict the results, and the next day I had the next lesson, and like, I didn't know exactly how to modify that lesson for half the students who get it and half the students who aren't prepared for it. What I did is I took that exact same exit ticket problem, and I just said, I'm not going to give this to all the students at the same time when the bell rings. When you think you're ready, come to me and I'll give you the exit ticket. And some students came right away. They said, Mr. Barnett, I get this. I said, okay, take the exit ticket. It was like one question. I prefer in math a show your work question, so I can tell it's not just a guess. It's one question. I can look at it. It takes me 5 seconds. Yeah, good. You showed your work. You got it. On to the next lesson. Or, hey, I see a mistake. Go sit with that other student because they had the same mistake. Figure it out, or let me explain it to you real quick, or go back to the video. And all of a sudden now, that exit ticket is giving me really good data because it's telling me, do students understand and how far along is each student? And I can actually take action from it as soon as I see it. I see the the mastery check, move on, or revise. Those are the two options. Exact same problem that I used to give to all students at once, but much more useful because I could do something with it as opposed to, like, at the end of the day, I have 150 exit tickets to look through. Half show mastery, half don't. What do I do tomorrow? And I think, if you're a teacher listening to this, you don't need to reinvent the wheel to do this. It's just about using what you already have in a different and perhaps, more strategic way. Instead of using your exit ticket before the bell rings, use it when students are ready. You already have a learning management system, I bet. Your students might already have Chromebooks. Like, make an easy video, let them watch the video. You don't need a recording studio. You don't need fancy technology. You don't need a new curriculum. You can make this model work with what you have.
Yeah, and you give some tips in the book about sort of the quality of the videos and some of those things. I'm curious, just I guess maybe as an average for, I don't know, an Algebra 1 course or something like that, how many videos are we looking at just roughly?
Yeah, I would say probably, you have a video per learning objective. And if in general you have one learning objective, per day, per lesson, and you have 150 lessons or something, then you probably have 150 videos. If you just listen to that right now and you say, oh my God, I have to do 150 videos, like, that feels like a lot. What I think is, if you can get on a video call, you can record a video, right? Start a Zoom with yourself, hit record, explain something, hit end recording, upload it. You have that video, and the video is 5 or 10 minutes, and maybe it takes you 15 or 20 minutes to create. So, that's an extra 150 times 15 or 20, but it's an investment because once you have that video, students can watch it at their own paces. They can watch it at home. They can watch it with their families, and you don't need to put on that performance 4 times per day when you're explaining it, right? I used to walk into school when I was lecturing and say, oh my God, I gotta amp myself up so I can give this performance 4 times per day. Once I had invested to make the videos, I said, okay, cool. I'm going to show up today. I'm going to help my students learn. When they have questions, I'm going to answer the questions. When they get lost, I'm going to get them back on track. If they get discouraged, I'm going to encourage them. It was way less stressful for me.
So one of the things that I talk about and talk with people, some might even say debate, which I think is a false dichotomy, but there is at least, I think, a spectrum of sort of more traditional instruction, science of learning kinds of things, direct instruction, explicit instruction, those kinds of things, and a more progressive kind of education. And I'm not really as interested in, which and one side, like where you are on one side or the other, that kind of thing, because I think we want teachers to think about the ways in which they can use a variety of approaches and things to help students, all succeed, right? But I am curious because I can imagine some pushback from both of those sides, and you've probably seen it, right? Like I can imagine the more traditional teachers saying these videos might you might have lots of inefficiency. You talked about productive struggle. That'll be a trigger for some of the sort of science of learning folks. There's not the chance for interleaving and retrieval practice necessarily. There's just some sort of mechanics of direct instruction that they might push back on. The more progressive inquiry constructivist kinds of educators might say this is too sort of rote, it's too mechanical, mechanized, that kind of thing. I'm curious what you've received as feedback and sort of pushback. Do you see it more from one end of that spectrum or the other, or how do you characterize any sort of pushback? Because I imagine you must get it, right?
Of course.
A new novel, unique idea and approach.
Yeah, well, I don't know how novel this is. I think we've done a good job of packaging it in a way that's accessible for teachers, but mastery learning has decades of research behind it, and people have been using, cassette tapes to deliver direct instruction, and then videos and all this. So I think there's a lot of history behind ideas like ours, but of course there's pushback. I mean, one thing I always say is, if you think this is going to work for you, it can. If you think it isn't, it won't. And in modern classrooms work, when we go into a new district, like we tell, even if the superintendent or principal is really into our model, we say, do not force this on anyone. It will not work. This should not be imposed. Like, this has to be something teachers want to do. And so if we have a contract with the school or district to train 100 teachers, like, we have to go out and recruit and get those 100 teachers to buy into our training and convince them that this is useful. And if there are teachers who say, this isn't me, this won't fit with me, like, that doesn't bother me in the slightest. I'm trying to help teachers who are interested, and I know amazing teachers who say this model is not for me, and like, that's totally fine. So the first thing I would say to people who say this won't work for what I believe is, okay, thank you for considering it. If there's any piece that I said that's interesting, try it out. If not, like, I trust you as a fellow educator to do what's best for your students. Those two types of pushback that you said, we get from both. I think probably a similarity in the worries that people on both sides have is about the human element of this. And I think there's a lot of fear that when you bring in computers, you lose the humanity of class. And I think if you think about that word, personalized learning, what often comes to mind is like students sitting at cubicles on screens, just on a computer all day. And that is not what I wanted to do as a teacher. That's not what I wanted as a student. I'm a parent. And that's not what I want my kids doing either, sitting in front of screens all day. So I think people on the direct instruction side or the constructivist side often say, look, the human is so important, and isn't this getting rid of the human side? What I think is, when you're using technology to sort of digitize direct instruction, your classroom actually becomes a much more human place. The teacher interactions with students are not like standing at the board giving directions. You're sitting down with the students, getting to know them, building relationships, and answering questions. Students don't have to be quiet and listen to you, because students are free at any time to ask their friends for help or support or work together on a challenge. So I felt like interactions in my classroom were much stronger when I implemented this model, when I was using technology in this way. And personally, I lean towards inquiry-based and project-based learning, and I felt like that worked really well with this model. Like, it's really hard to give a complex project in a whole class way, because if students miss Monday and Tuesday and they come in on Wednesday, it's hard to start like a complex project midway through. But if students can move at their own paces, they can do projects much better. And that's part of what inspired me to teach this way. I also know a lot of teachers who are much more on, instruction is I do, we do, you do. Like, the video replaces the I do. The practice together after the video replaces the we do. The mastery check is the you do. And like, we're going to go in a super traditional sort of model, a super traditional, like, lesson by lesson by lesson, skill by skill by skill approach. But just the delivery will be more self-paced and mastery-based. So I've seen his work both ways, but the criticism's legitimate, right? And if you're listening to this and you're not convinced by anything I say, don't do it. Like, I trust you to do what's best for you and your students.
So one of the things that I mentioned and you mentioned is sort of can be a trigger for some of the folks on the more traditional side is that idea of productive struggle. And I think that is a term that can be misunderstood or misused. I mean, I think productive struggle can be really, really helpful. We want sort of to be right on that, sort of zone of proximal development, right? We want students to be challenged, but not too challenged so that it's frustrating and they shut down. But we also don't want it to be too easy or boring and those kinds of things. Oftentimes, I think when people talk about productive struggle in a critical way, they envision students just really not having any clue how to do something, and we're just asking them. They conflate inquiry with discovery learning. So, well, we're just asking students to figure it out on their own, and that's frustrating. It's inefficient, and we should never do that kind of thing. I'm largely in agreement with that. So I'm curious, when you talk about productive struggle, what does that look like just logistically? How long are we talking about this sort of productive struggle? And why do you think it's important to do some of that before, if I'm understanding you correctly, getting them into the digitized direct instruction?
Yeah, I mean, I think a challenge with productive struggle is if you're having students struggle, but you're never ensuring they reach mastery, you're going to make their lives miserable, right? Like if your class is giving students a lot of things to struggle with, but on Monday they struggle with one thing and they don't get it, and on Tuesday they struggle with another thing and they don't get it, and on Wednesday they struggle with another thing and they don't get it, they're going to hate math. They're not going to like learning totally. When you pair that struggle with the requirement of mastery, though, then I think it's a different situation because I struggle, but I don't move on to the next challenge until I achieve mastery. And when I achieve mastery, I build confidence, I build self-esteem, I build understanding. So like the only thing that makes that productive struggle worthwhile is that there's success on the other side of it. There's understanding. And in a modern classroom, you wouldn't have that situation where the student struggles 6 lessons in a row without ever getting it because they don't advance to lesson 2 until they've mastered lesson 1. So I think that addresses, I think, some of the concerns about having students do that struggle. And in a modern classroom, the student is always in that zone of proximal development, right? Because if the content's really easy, I'm just going to speed through lesson after lesson after lesson until I reach the point where I'm challenged. But I'm not going to get to lesson 4 without understanding the lessons 1, 2, and 3. So I'm never going to be like way too far out there where it's too hard. Why I believe in productive struggle is I think that's what motivates the learning, right? Why should you learn about anything? Because it helps you solve some kind of problem. And if you don't understand what the problem is that motivates the learning, that motivates the creation of the knowledge, what's the point of learning it, right? The whole reason as a math teacher, the whole reason people developed all these mathematical techniques was to solve problems. So I could just tell students, here's the formula for this, here's the formula for that, here's the formula for this, but like, what's the point? The point is it helps you solve the problem. And I think that giving students exposure to the problem makes the solution meaningful. Once you've struggled to figure something out for 10 or 15 minutes, you're going to be hungry for the solution. You're going to be eager for me to explain to you the mathematical concept. I think that's more engaging and more powerful to students than, hey, here's this random formula I want you to learn. Now go do a bunch of problems.
So, again, lingering a little bit here on this productive struggle, when you're talking about a problem to sort of set up that hunger, are you thinking, I mean, specifically like a math equation as a problem or a problem of application, like, how do you, I don't know, I'm not a math guy, but, how do you figure a tip? I'll use an example that's, very simple math, right? How do you figure a tip accurately at, 10, 15, 20, or 25% or something like that? Uh, Asking students to do something like that and figure out what math equations and processes would be useful and maybe a system to do that or something like that, or are you talking about problems that are actual those math problems that one would do to figure out those tips? Does that make sense?
Yeah, so maybe I can give just an example of how
Yeah.
I taught thinking. So I taught a lot about functions and mathematical models, y equals mx plus b. And so I could tell you to graph a line, it's y equals mx plus b, figure out, the slope of the line going through 2 points or whatever. What I did with my students is I had a project, I called it the demographer project. I said, choose a population that interests you. A lot of students would choose, either places or maybe animal populations, endangered species. And I'd say, okay, what was the population 10 years ago? What's the population today? Take your best guess for what the population is going to be in 20 years. And they would struggle with that for a little bit. And then I'd say, okay, one way you could do this is on a graph, right? And that introduces the idea of the mathematical model. And I say, practice drawing a few graphs. And then I'd say, okay, well, the population of, Washington, D.C. was this. Today it's this. Assume that it grows at a constant rate per year. How many people are added per year? They think about that a little bit. And then I say, okay, here's the concept of slope. And so I could tell you the slope of a line is, the rise over run between point x1, y1 and point x2, y2, figure out the slope. But if I give you a little bit of context and say, we're trying to figure out how much the population of a city you care about is going to grow, then the student's not going to ask, Mr. Barnett, why are we learning about slope? Because that question is already answered in the design of the problem. The reason you're learning about this is to predict when the humpback whale is going to go extinct. And so I think, like, the student struggles. Before you tell the student how to calculate an average rate of change, they're going to struggle to do it because they don't understand the formula for it, right? But that's healthy, because after they spend 10 or 15 minutes being like, yeah, I would like to know how much the population's increasing, but I kind of get it, but I kind of don't. Then you show the video that says, here's the formula, y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. They say, oh my God, now I get it. This is clear. This helps me understand something I care about. That's what I mean by sort of productive struggle and inquiry-based learning. And I get a critic who says, yeah, like, your students are spending so much time thinking about whales, and actually what they should be thinking about is formulas and math. Just tell them how to do it and give them a bunch of practice. Like, I get that. It's not my own personal belief about what I think, students should be in school for. I think they should be spending time engaging with interesting things more than accumulating knowledge. But I think the other side of that is legitimate. I think a modern classroom practices can be used to make more engaging project about whales, or it can be used to make a smoother, direct delivery of content. I think it's a framework that teachers can and do use in different ways.
Yeah, well, the way you describe it there is similar in lots of ways to the way that I describe our inquiry work and what I would say knowledge-rich inquiry and our project-based learning work, because in a sense, what you're asking students to do is to think about a problem, a large, like you mentioned, the population or something like that. And in order to solve that and figure that out, one of the things that I think we really want students to develop is that sense of, what do I need to know in order to figure this out? Right. And that's essentially an inquiry move that I think is left out of, sort of that move of, well, I'll just tell them how to do it. Right. And we can just live in this sort of cold, my editorial here, the cold mechanical math world of functions and numbers and equations. That's interesting to some people. Perhaps you, as a math guy, perhaps not, but not. I've got two daughters, and they're not very interested in that kind of thing. And it's not necessarily true that they will be interested in figuring out the population kinds of problems either. There's an inherent problem there, but it certainly, I think, lends itself more to that. And not only do we want students to know those math equations and slope and the things that you mentioned, but we also want to give them an opportunity to develop the idea or the sort of mindset of, I need to figure out what I need to know and learn in order to figure out how to do this, right? Whether it's that population question that you mentioned, or I'm going to move across the country, and how do I figure out what I need to know and learn in order to do that successfully, or any number of kinds of things. And one thing that they will often come back and criticize and critique is it's terribly inefficient. But I think that there's and this is a question I want to segue into thinking about, what are the sort of criteria for success and the evidence of that success that you have seen in the work that you're advocating for here. But there's definitely evidence that direct instruction is very efficient in terms of building knowledge. I'd love to see studies, and it intuitively seems true to me that if you sort of give students a more sort of gestalt big picture, which I think is what that sort of productive struggle problem that you're mentioning allows for, is like, oh, we're seeing that this is a complex, very difficult issue and problem we're working on, with lots of, very specific things, some of them math, and even, breaking them down into the specific math equations and moves and those kinds of things, that when you have that context, I think productive struggle in that way may feel really inefficient at first, but there's likely, if done well, a sort of crystallization that can happen towards the end that can actually lead to more efficiency. So that's my soapbox. But I'm curious, talking about the evidence piece, what is the evidence, like when you say this is successful, the teachers and students are being successful using this approach, what quantitatively is that? And perhaps there's some qualitative kinds of things. What are those markers of outcomes of success for the work that you're advocating for?
Yeah, great question. And I agree. I thank you for getting on the soapbox, because I agree with that also. I don't think find the slope of the line between 2 points is an interesting math problem. The interesting math problem is, when is the humpback whale going to go extinct? We just use math to solve it. But anyways, to your question, like, what are the measures of success? First of all, we're not looking at, inquiry-based learning versus direct instruction, which of these is more successful, because, as I say, we have sort of an instructional delivery method that can be used in both contexts. What we're looking at is a few things, teacher survey data, student survey data, and then student achievement data. So when we speak with teachers, we've done several, studies where we will survey teachers who have done our training and use our approach, survey this, teachers in the same schools who aren't using our approach. And we ask things like, I feel like I can meet every learner's needs. I feel like I can reach students at all levels of understanding. I feel like I can help students catch up when they've missed class. And we just see significant differences, significant improvements among the teachers we've trained. They feel like they're better able to differentiate. They feel like they can help students catch up. They feel, I think they feel in general more effective and more optimistic, and they just feel like inspired by sort of this new approach to teaching. When we speak to students, we see same approach, modern classroom students versus traditional students, the effects are not as pronounced just in terms of the data, but we do see a positive trend. Students feel like they have closer relationships with their teachers often. I think that gets to the point about technology making class more human. They feel like they're more capable of learning everything. In some studies, they've said they're more likely to enjoy learning. They want to take more classes like modern classroom classes. And so there's that, sort of subjective element that teachers and students are preferring being in modern classrooms, and I think that's really important. When it comes to student achievement data, we're in the middle of a randomized control trial where we're actually going to go to middle school classrooms. We're going to randomly select teachers to get our training and see the outcomes on, math scores. That's sort of the gold standard of research. And so we're committed to figuring out in the most rigorous possible kind of conditions, what are our impacts? We don't have that yet. What we do have is data from a lot of individual schools and districts where they say, here's where our scores were before modern classrooms, here's where our scores are now, or here are the scores of students in the modern classrooms, here are the scores of the students in traditional classrooms. And it's not like every single study we've seen, the modern classrooms are way ahead. Sometimes there's not significant differences, but in several cases there have been really significant differences where we're seeing, after we go in and we train a lot of teachers at a school, their scores are really increasing. That doesn't prove causation here, right? There could be any number of things that impact scores. A randomized control trial doesn't prove causation either, at least in this context. It's really difficult to prove causation, but it will provide much stronger evidence. And so I think in terms of survey data, we've got really, really strong evidence already. We've had researchers from Johns Hopkins University sort of conduct these surveys 3 separate years, and they all found consistent trends. In terms of achievement data, there's a lot of positive indicators. Nothing that I would say is totally rock solid yet, but that's why we're doing the randomized control trial. We're trying to, in the most rigorous way possible, see what are the impacts.
Right. Well, that I'll look forward to hearing the results. I'm sure you will as well. One thing that we've lingered on a lot here is teaching math. You were a math teacher, but in the book you talk about, and there's lots of sort of teacher tips or stories from teachers. What about the teachers outside of math? I was a social studies teacher or a humanities teacher. Do you see, how do you see this approach looking and being applied in, non-math courses?
Yeah, I go back to what I said earlier. If you think this will work, it will. And I think that's been the case in other subjects and other grade levels. Kareem and I were both high school math teachers, and when we started Modern Classrooms Project, we had no idea whether this would work in elementary classrooms, social studies classrooms, English classrooms. We sort of gave our knowledge to teachers, and they went and they made it work. And I've now been in all kinds of classes at all grade levels where this is working beautifully. Teachers and students are happy, and you can just feel it. It's like the college library. There's a lot of learning going on. I think the reason that it can work so broadly is that I think the challenge I described at the beginning, some students being ahead and bored, some behind and lost, some absent, that's fundamental. Every teacher faces that same challenge. Doesn't matter what school you're in. I taught in a public high school in Washington, D.C. I taught at an elite international boarding school in Switzerland. Couldn't have been more different in terms of the context of the schools. Same challenges as a teacher, students all over the place. And to the extent that all these subjects involve some kind of, what I'm calling direct instruction, but to the extent that all these subjects involve some times when the teacher wants to explain something to the students, I think that's so much better done through video and one-on-one small group conversation than through sort of whole class teacher-paced sit and be quiet instruction. So I think the fundamental challenge explains why. And in the book, there's a kindergarten teacher, there's a university professor. I was able to, I was in touch with teachers in Australia and Zambia and Sweden and all over the US, and their context and what they teach is so different, but what they say is the same. I didn't know how to meet all my learners' needs. These practices are helping. So if you're listening and you think something I've said can help you, I'm sure you're right.
Well, I know you've got to go. There's definitely some other questions I'm sure folks might be listening or thinking about some management issues and to hear more about non-math courses. But you do have to go. I want to give you the opportunity to share links. The book is Meet Every Learner's Needs, and it's out now, I think, right? Is it?
Yeah.
Where should they go? Where should they find you, and all those good things?
Yeah, I mean, you can find the book anywhere books are sold, at least online. I don't know if it's sold enough yet to make it into any physical bookstores. But I mean, there's a website for the book at meeteverylearnersneeds.org. Also, Modern Classrooms Project is a nonprofit. We make all of our resources available to teachers for free. We have a free online course, which is totally comprehensive and shares everything you need to know to learn this model. So, if you prefer an online course to a book, I encourage you to start there, and it won't cost you anything. And if you're wondering about sort of how does this look, how does this feel, our free online course and our website, which is just modernclassrooms.org, has videos from elementary classrooms, from social studies classrooms. You can watch that there. We've got so many examples of teachers. They might not teach your exact same course, but you'll see an example of how's this look in an elementary classroom? How's this look in a middle school English classroom? Like, there's examples there. And then the last thing I would encourage is we have a Facebook group. It's called Modern Classrooms Teacher Discussion. It's about 20,000 teachers strong from all over the world, and it's a great place where teachers are sharing their successes, their struggles, how they make it work for their grade level, their school community, their content area. And so there's so many resources out there that we try to make available for teachers who are interested in learning more, for administrators and parents as well.
Okay, well, like I said, I know you need to go. The book, again, is Meet Every Learner's Needs, Modern Classrooms Project. Definitely an interesting sort of approach and way to think about teaching and learning, and I appreciate the conversation.
Likewise, thank you.
What we need to do is spend enough time together that we can start to translate our ideas into each other's language and include one another in this community of inquiry. And that is the work of love.